It's important to remember how Rishi Sunak came into this job. Normally, Whitehall civil servants work up a file based on a candidate in a general election, how to fulfil their promises, or a candidate in an internal election, how to fulfil their promises. They didn't really work on that too hard during the summer because it seemed quite obvious that Liz Truss was going to win the internal contest within the Conservative Party, and she did. But Rishi Sunak sort of accidentally fell into power after that, and he and his team have been sitting in Number 10 trying to work out what the priorities are and what is actually achievable. They've also been trying to work out whether to give a speech like this. They have a strong sense that the public are not in the mood for vision speeches. You said this is the nearest thing we've got to his vision, quite right. But it's not the conventional new political leader, this is what I'm all about, showboating. And that's another word you hear about in Number 10. They don't think the voters have any appetite for that kind of thing either. One other thing you heard in this speech, I think, is a little bit of dog whistle attacks on Boris Johnson. Number 10 would deny it. They'd say that when there was talk of people promising the earth, politicians being all talk and broken trust, that was that no names were mentioned, and indeed none were. But you couldn't help thinking there was a bit of dog whistle going on there. What did we actually learn today? Well, we did learn at one point in the question and answer after the speeches that Rishi Sunak thinks the idea that was coming out of the NHS recently to ease pressure that you should stop elective surgery, he was not in favour of that. He said that would add to the problems. Also, in the question and answer session, we had a little bit of signalling that Rishi Sunak is interested in accelerating next year's pay review system, which would normally report in July, accelerating the whole process there and trying to merge next year's pay with this year's pay to try and get the government out of some pickles, not least with the nurses. Mainly, though, what we learnt was those pledges. As you said, Labour saying that they're not very difficult to comply with and that they've been confected with that in mind. Some economists and business figures saying, well, actually, getting growth this year, anything that really feels or looks like growth, could be very difficult, and some of those other pledges as well. Very interestingly, Rishi Sunak emphasised today that he thinks the public will judge him on how hard he actually tried. Chesterfield Hospital emergency wing today. The Prime Minister knows the images of patients in corridors or ambulances queuing up are imprinted on the public's mind. Not a perfect time to ask everyone to listen up to your wider plans, but after 10 weeks in the job, Rishi Sunak's team wanted to quell talk that he couldn't describe his mission.
5 promises. We will halve inflation, grow the economy, reduce debt, cut waiting lists and stop the boats. Those are the people's priorities. They are your government's priorities, and we will either have achieved them or not. No tricks, no ambiguity. We're either delivering for you or we're not. We will rebuild trust in politics through action or not at all.
Rishi Sunak also spoke about his passion for education, the need to innovate across the economy, and he repeatedly differentiated himself from unnamed politicians who talk big but don't deliver.
I will only promise what I can deliver, and I will deliver what I promise. Thank you. Thank you.
Can I just, in the interest of clearing up any ambiguity, clarify which of these pledges are for this year? Halving inflation this year, you said, in line with most forecasts, including the OBR. What about the others? Growing the economy this year? NHS waiting lists falling this year? You said new laws to stop small boats. Well, maybe you could do that this year, but would you stop small boats this year?
I'm keen to deliver on the plans that we've set out, that we'll see inflation halving, as I said, by the end of this year. And at the same time, I'd like the economy to be growing by then as well. So those 2 goals are both for this year. And by spring of next year, we will have practically eliminated those waiting over a year, with the overall waiting list falling. And then lastly, we're keen to introduce legislation as soon as practically possible. Ultimately, Parliament decides how long it takes to pass that legislation. But in all of these things, I've deliberately not put a specific month on each of them because I don't think that's responsible or the right thing to do with goals that are so complicated, where many of the forces that will impact our ability to hit them are out of my control as well.
Rishi Sunak said voters would judge him on whether he'd strained every sinew to deliver his pledges. He's wary of huge promises, thinks the voters have little appetite for a big vision speech. Until now, much of his communication with the public has been through Downing Street in-house videos.
Hi. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Chris. It's Rishi Sunak. How are you?
Rishi Sunak doesn't love the big stage the way Boris Johnson did, and he wasn't announcing a Liz Truss-style economic revolution. He repeatedly emphasised his focus on delivery.
Over recent months, years actually, Britain's often been compared with Italy and the political and economic crises that happened there. They've occasionally had, to restore calm, a technocrat who's taken over. Are you our technocrat?
In the interest of time, actually, I think, well, hopefully you can digest the speech in longer time, but I think the country at the moment has a very clear set of priorities that they want their government to focus on.
He is trying to solve the problems that are in front of him. That's his brand. That's what he does. He's a detail-oriented guy.
A whiff of the technocrat?
I mean, yes, he is a very clever, very capable, very detail-oriented guy. That's why the party turned to him after what happened.
What happened is the Tory psychodrama that Rishi Sunak is trying to live down. He said he hoped voters would judge him on his own actions in government, especially during COVID, and whether he can now deliver on the promises made today.
Gary Gibbon. Well, the Prime Minister acknowledged that seeing ambulances queuing outside hospitals made people understandably anxious. And one of those 5 pledges he made earlier today was to tackle NHS waiting lists. So how has his speech been received? Our health and social care editor, Victoria MacDonald, is with me. What have you been hearing?
Well, this is against a background of just the most horrendous winter so far for the NHS. And I was speaking to somebody today who described it as a polycrisis, not just a crisis, the worst that the NHS has ever been through, because it's across the board: social care, primary care, mental health services, hospitals, the ambulances that we're seeing queuing. So what was their reaction? Well, that this speech, of course, did not go far enough. It did not give enough detail. It was probably never intended to. Waiting lists has always been something that the public has cared a lot about, but right now, actually, the public is caring much more about seeing those ambulances. And I spoke to the think tank, the Health Foundation, and they said, we need more detail.
Some of the solutions that he mentioned, more money for the National Health Service, more doctors and nurses, are true, but they don't meet the scale of the issue. And in fact, the funding for the NHS over the next 2 years is less than half a long-run historic average. So there's no way that there's going to be modernisation under that sort of scenario. And that's not even taking into account any pay settlement for the nurses or the ambulance workers that is beyond 2%, which is what it's been set at.
And of course, that 2% is the next pay settlement, not the one that they're striking about right now. We've got 2 more days of strikes for nurses, 2 more strikes for paramedics this month. And again, everybody in the health service was saying to the Prime Minister, please start some negotiations because we just cannot cope with this.
Victoria MacDonald. Well, after Rishi Sunak's speech today, I spoke to the Pensions Minister, Laura Trott. Laura Trott, Rishi Sunak says, judge me by these 5 things that I set. You don't get to choose what things voters judge you by, do you?
I think what was set out today was a very clear people's priorities. You know, if you talk to people, this is what they're worried about. And that is why the Prime Minister today set out these foundations, the things that he wants the government to focus on, because they are the things that he knows that the people at home really, really care about. So no, of course we don't get to, tell people what they're judging us on, but those are the things that we know they care about.
They might judge you on political chaos, on strikes, on the NHS, on all sorts of things, mightn't they?
Well, we've got a plan for those. I think what we've set out today, though, is a vision for what the government is going to do in the next year. We're going to be looking at halving the inflation rate, making sure get the economy growing again.
But just on inflation, let's go through them. I mean, you say the government is going to halve inflation. That's not true, is it? Inflation is on track to be halved. The OBR says that. And that's because the Bank of England has raised interest rates, because energy prices are forecast to come down. These are not instruments of government policy.
These are things that the government have contributed towards.
You
right?
don't get credit for lowering inflation unless you accept the blame for inflation where it is now.
I think this is the point about monetary and fiscal policy working together. The government set out an autumn statement which very clearly settled the markets, helped point us towards, putting the economy back on where we wanted it to be.
But when you look at these 5 things, restoring economic growth from what could be a very long recession, bringing down inflation, bringing down waiting lists, stopping the small boats, do you not ask yourself, who on earth has been in charge of the country? How has it got so bad?
Well, I'm very proud of what this government, the Conservative government, has achieved in the past, what's the 13 years now.
But
if you look at making
all about
people
righting the mess you've made. They're not about delivering something we didn't have before.
I'm proud of making work pay. I'm proud of better schools in this country. But we also have to face the reality that COVID has had a real impact on this country. The Prime Minister spoke today about the reduction in the number of operations that were carried out during the pandemic, which were necessary, but we now need to fix. And we don't shy away from the fact that we want to deliver for the people of Britain. That is what the Prime Minister is here to do.
The NHS isn't just a mess because of COVID, is it? It's a mess because of structural decisions made by this government involving the care system, involving the reduction of beds, the centralisation of services. These are all the things that have contributed to the problem of flow of patients through the NHS. It's not just COVID.
I'm not trying to argue at all that the NHS was perfect before COVID, but I think, most people sitting at home would accept that COVID has had a huge impact on our health service.
He said we should hold the health service to account. How do I hold my GP to account when I can't get an appointment?
Well, I think we've got more GPs than ever before. This is something that is being...
How do I hold him to account or her to account?
Well, what the speech was about today was about holding the government to account. There were very clear metrics about how to hold the government to account.
No, that's not what he said. He said patients should be able to hold the health service to account. How do I hold the health service to account when I can't get an appointment?
Well, I think the key thing from my perspective, from what I heard, was about the government being held to account for these key metrics that we set out today, about halving inflation, about getting the economy growing again, to making sure that waiting lists are falling, making sure that we're stopping the small boats, and also making sure that our debt is falling over the short term.
He also said he wants to deliver the best possible education to every child. He said it's very personal to him, and it's because he had the best possible education. A Winchester education costs over £30,000 per pupil. The per pupil cost in an English secondary school in a state system is less than £6,000. How do you deliver the best for a fifth of the cost of the best?
Well, we've increased funding to education in this country, but it's more than that. If you look at the improvement in education since 2010, it's one of the things I, as a Conservative, am incredibly proud of. And it's about brilliant teachers, setting them free, reducing paperwork, setting high expectations in the curriculum, focusing on what really matters.
Education, is it? That's what he talks about, wanting for everybody. You can't deliver the best possible education in your current funding formula.
I dispute that. I think that you can have amazing teachers that inspire children to do great things. That's not about money. These are about these brilliant teachers. We need to get behind them and support them, and I know that's what the Prime Minister is going to do.
I mean, ultimately, what you seem to be saying is, we will be competent again, so vote for us. Do you really think that competence after years of incompetence is going to do it for you?
I think there is a narrative that you're trying to push here, which is that the Conservative government since 2010 has not achieved anything. And I could not dispute that more strongly. If you look at the fact that it now pays to go to work for the first time, if you look at our education, if you look what we've done in terms of Brexit, these are huge achievements of Conservative governments. Yes, we've got problems now, but we know...
What have you done about Brexit? When you say, when you've achieved on Brexit?
Well,
what have you achieved on Brexit?
We've left the European Union because there was a vote which showed that was what people wanted,
and that's now contributing
and we've delivered on that.
Problems.
We have delivered on a democratic mandate to leave the European Union.
But you accept that it is contributing to lower growth?
I accept that we have done something that was very, very difficult, and there was a huge amount of argument about, and the British people wanted.
And do you accept the view of the OBR that it's contributed to lower growth?
I think that there have been a lot of things that have happened in this country in the past couple of years. We've had COVID, we've had the Ukrainian war, they've had a huge impact on the economy, and that was mean that we haven't been able to do a lot of things that we want to embrace those Brexit freedoms in a way that we could have been able to otherwise. So I think that is now what we need to focus on as a government.
Laura Schroll, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, Conservative ministers may still be talking about their achievements of recent years, but unsurprisingly, opposition MPs are less convinced. Earlier, I spoke to Labour's Shadow Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, and asked her what she made of the Prime Minister's promises today.
We've had 13 years now of Conservative government, and the fact the NHS is in such a parlous state and that patients are waiting hours on end to be seen in A&E or can't ever get a doctor's appointment, that's down to the actions of Rishi Sunak and his government. And it was a very thin speech overall. I don't think it set out the vision for the Britain that we desperately need to see.
But Labour can't keep saying this is a problem of the government's making. People want promises and they want to know what are politicians' priorities. So for Labour, for example, what concrete action would you take that would help the crisis we're seeing in the NHS at the moment?
Well, I do think people recognise, however, that when you've had 13 years, that is a long time to make change in a country, and in many ways things are going backwards and things are getting worse.
But it doesn't take the debate forward, though, does it?
No, but where Labour, where we have set out clear plans and areas of difference with the government, is take, for example, the expansion that we would deliver in our NHS workforce. We know that there are massive pressures at the moment, so our plans around expanding the number of medical training places, expanding the number of district nurses and health visitors, and making sure that we've got the staff that we need in our NHS with a real plan to deliver the workforce that we need to see. The government has got no similar plan, and part of the reason we're facing such pressure on our health service is because of that workforce crisis that they have presided over. That, you know, they are responsible for the problems.
But on so many areas, people cannot wait. People need real change right now. We see swathes of the public sector striking, and yet many people not clear what Labour's position on strikes are. Aside from saying get round the table, what is Labour's position on strikes?
That where strikes take place, they represent a failure to get an agreement. But you do, in order to avoid strikes and in order to get an agreement that all sides can live with, then you do have to get around the table and have a conversation and try and negotiate and reach a settlement. And ministers are consistently failing to do that, whether it's in NHS or our health service.
What matters is what is said round that table. That's what matters, isn't it? And Labour have already conceded, like the government, that inflation level or higher than inflation rises are unaffordable. So you're in lockstep with the government on that.
Look, you've got to be around the table having that conversation if you're ever going to get an agreement. And if ministers refuse to talk about this, if they won't get around the table with trade unions, then strikes will continue. And that's the last thing that I want to see.
What you wouldn't be doing right now is offering up inflation level or higher than inflation pay rises. That's just fact, isn't it?
I'm not going to come on here and plug a figure from the air. As I say, it is a process of negotiation, but you've got to be around the table in order to have that negotiation. And if government ministers are not going to do that, then the strikes will continue.
The Prime Minister says he will move to bring in legislation to make it more difficult to strike. Would Labour, a Labour government, reverse such proposals or not?
Well, they haven't happened yet, so our priority will be to try and stop it ever happening in the first place and to block them and to press the Prime Minister to do his job and enter into a proper process of negotiation. You know, no one wants to see strikes.
But there is a difficulty for Labour, isn't there, in terms of its half-in, half-out view on strikes. Mick Lynch, the head of the RMT union, says Labour could lose working people at the next election because they've refused to come out fully and back strikes, because Keir Starmer won't say he would reverse any legislation, because Keir Starmer has told shadow ministers that they cannot be on the picket line. There is a danger in that for you, isn't there?
I think at the next general election, the choice will be between a Conservative government that has overseen consistent failure to support workers, that has seen pay falling and that sees real pressure on our public services and a failure to grow our economy, in contrast with a Labour Party that's got a really positive and hopeful and optimistic vision about how we can build a better Britain, how we deliver for working people. There is so much, I think, that we can achieve as a country, but we didn't hear any of that today from the Prime Minister, and I don't think we're going to see much more than more of the same, really, from this government.
Bridget Phillipson, thanks very much for talking to us today.
Thank you.